Welcome to a second in the series on Peace TV on the issue of renewing civilizations, what we can learn from the best practices of the Muslim or civilizations amongst the Muslims. What we've done is talk in our first program about the Mecca model. In our first program, we talked about the Mecca model. That is, we took a look at what the situation was when Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born, and what he had to contend with as he grew up, and what he had to contend with when he got the message, and the reaction that he found from the people in his community, particularly of his own blood relative. And so in looking at that, we talked about three things. We talked about feel, right? We talked about the whole issue of the elephants. We talked about the foundation of Islam, that is the context in which Islam came. And we talked about the concept of forbearance. To review for a moment, why did we talk about feel? Because we wanted to give you, the viewers, a little flavor of the kind of community that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born into, and indeed the kind of world community in which he was born into. It was a community where where might makes right. That is, in the case of feel, we found out that the king of Abyssinia had sent Abraha, who was his governor, to destroy the Kaaba because he felt insulted by what one Arab had done in the church that Abraha had built in Yemen in order as a tribute to him because he had a disagreement with the king. This is the situation that Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, came into, where might makes right. As a result of this situation, the short version of this story here, the result of this situation, Abraha was ordered by the king of Abyssinia to destroy the Kaaba. And what they did is that they got what people would do in this day and age, what they would call the weapons of mass destruction of that particular time, or the weapons of mass destruction of that particular time were elephant. And some number is not clear. If you read Ibn Kathir, his source has been Ibn Ishaq, one of the first biographers of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. We don't know exactly how many elephants. Some say 6, some say 8. But there was general agreement that there was a very large one, the biggest weapon of mass destruction. His name was Mahmud, and that he struck terror into the hearts of the people that saw him because he was so big and that he caused so much destruction just by his sheer size alone. And so we tell the story of feel because we see this is a story of might makes right. And indeed, when they marched from Yemen to Mecca, they destroyed everything in their path. Indeed, when they marched from Yemen to Mecca, towards Mecca, they destroyed everything in their path until they got to Mecca. And as we know, Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, the famous story that's related to us, he had talked to Abraha about saving his camels and told Abraha that Allah would save his own house. And in fact, we know this is what happened, that by stopping Mahmud, the biggest elephant, that is, the biggest elephant, Mahmud refused, was willing to move in every direction except in the direction of the Kaaba, and also stones of baked clay rained down upon the armory of Abraha and caused them the flesh to drop off their bones and ultimate death, including Abraha, who didn't die right away. It's reported that he died a very, very painful death. So what that told us is that this was a situation where people saw might as making right. This is a situation that Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings, came into. And this was a situation wherein Allah's name was known and Allah protected his house. Then we looked at the foundations upon which Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. In other words, the cultural context into which Islam came. And what is that cultural context? The first was polytheism. They had not maintained the worship of one God. That's what the Kaaba was built for, according to our Muslim sources, was the worship of one God. By this time, by the time of the birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, there were only over 300 idols enshrined in the Kaaba. By the time of the birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and we're talking around 5770 Common Era, and by this time, more than 300 idols had been enshrined in the Kaaba. So no question, they were polytheistic. They were also patriarchal in a very negative way. There's a way of exercising male authority or father authority or family authority that's positive within the proper context. But in a very negative way, they used to bury girl babies. They used to bury girl babies alive. and Allah, highly glorified is He said He would question people. He says this in the Quran, that He would question people for what sin, for what crime. He would question people on Yom Kippur, the day of standing, the day of judgment, for what crime were these babies buried, for what crime were these innocent little babies killed. They practiced this infanticide. They also had a situation where women had no rights. Women would have multiple husbands, which really devolved into a form of prostitution, and a situation where they couldn't really have any power and authority in the public sphere. And so this is the kind of patriarchy that we found. We also found a kind of patronage where might makes right, and if you were the client of somebody mighty, you could get away with certain things. And so might made right, just like in the context of the elephants, might made right at that particular time. But we said the key word for that program, that particular first program, was forbearance. And what was forbearance? A word to remember if you were going to give a test. Forbearance is patience. Forbearance is tolerance. Forbearance is being good-natured in the face of difficulties. Hilm is the Arabic word that we're talking about. And that was the key concept for the first episode. So we're now in the second episode, and the key concept here is the rule of law. The key concept or idea that we'd like to come back to at the end of this episode is the rule of law. And what we're going to look at right now is the model that we see in Medina. We looked at the model, and that is, we looked at the model of Mecca, that is, we looked at the situation that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born into. We looked at the situation that where he came into prophethood. We looked at the situation of how he treated up until the time that he left. We made the point that the message that he brought was resisted by the Quraysh, right? He was ridiculed for the message that he brought, and people were so enraged at him that they attempted to kill him, and this led to his making hijrah to Yathrib, which became Mecca, the city of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. And so we're looking at the situation. I know we're covering a lot of territory, but I would recommend for those of you who are not familiar with it, to find a good book of seerah, a good book of biography of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. But if you're interested in understanding this particular aspect of his career, I would recommend a very, very short book by a brother named Al-Umari, A-L-U-M-A-R-I, last name A-L-U-M-A-R-I. I recommend the book, and the book's name is The Medinian Society at the Time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Medinian Society at the Time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. This book was published in 1995, and it was published by the International Institute of Islamic Thought out of Herndon, Virginia, and it should be very, very easy for those who order off of the internet or find at an Islamic bookstore or at other bookstores for that matter. So, because we're going to be going fairly quickly because these programs are very short and we can only skim over the ideas here. So we're looking at the Medina model, and we're looking at the concept of rule of law, the concept of rule of law. And this is something that you think you need for a civilization. What do we get from the Medina model in relationship to the concept of the rule of law? First of all, let's look at the concept of mediation, right? We look at the concept of mediation, we look at the concept of mutuality, we look at the concept of merger. Mediation, merger, and mutuality. Why mediation? When we look at how it came to be from a social historical perspective, not from a religious perspective, from the sources that we have, from a social historical perspective, how it came to be that Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, went from Mecca to Medina, we find the following. Number one, from a historical perspective, we have a group of people coming from what was called Yathrib at that particular time, and coming to him and talking to him about coming to Yathrib. We'll pick this story up right after our break. We hope that you continue to join us as we look at the topic of renewing civilizations, what we can learn from best practices of the Muslims or civilization amongst the Muslims. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you for joining us. We're now in the second of a series on the issue of renewing civilization, what we can learn from best practices of the Muslims. This is a very important topic, as we said in the first segment. It's a very important topic because we find ourselves in the 21st century facing three major crises. One is economic crisis, second is an environmental crisis, and the third is an ethical crisis. And we're hoping that this kind of discussion, this discussion of renewing civilizations, what we can learn from best practices of the Muslims, will help all of us, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, deal with these three crises: the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, and the ethical crisis that we face in the world today. As we pointed out in the first part of the show, in the first segment of this series, we talked about the Mecca model. We talked about the situation into which Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was born. We talked about the situation that he took prophethood in when he was about 40 years old, the society in which he was in. And we talked about the resistance that he met to the message that he brought. We talked about the ridicule that people heaped upon him. They called him Majnun, they called him crazy. They called him a poet, which was a way of devaluing his message, that he somehow made it up in order to entertain the people or to influence the people. And they would do things like sweep brambles in his way, put animal entrails on his back when he's making prostration in order to pray. So they ridiculed him, and they were so enraged at him that he would go against the religion of their forefathers. But from a social-cultural perspective, one would guess that the major reason that they were enraged at him is that him insisting as Abraham, his role model, as he was told through the Quran, Abraham, his role model, insisted before him that his people return to the worship of one God. This enraged the people because by returning to the worship of one God, many of them thought they would lose the advantage that they had by being custodians of the sacred house, by being custodians of the Kaaba. And so they resisted him, they ridiculed him, and their rage, and they even boycotted the people of his Bani Hashim, the people of his tribe. They even boycotted him at this particular time. And so it's very important to understand that this was not a comfortable situation for him, but indeed, he was going to say, La ilaha illallah, no matter what. There's no God but God. So where we picked up the story before our break, where we dropped the story before our break, rather, is that delegation came from Yathrib. Yathrib was a very, very different place from Mecca. Mecca was a commercial area, and Yathrib was an agricultural area. These are two very different ways of being. In the United States of America, it's like the difference between New York City and being in a city in Iowa, a small city in Ames, Iowa. So these are two different cultural contexts, two different ways of being. So anyway, people came from Yathrib. This is a place where Arabs and Jews lived together. We understand from the history that the Jews probably had settled there before this particular oasis in Yathrib. And we find a situation where there was internal strife all of the time. There was always bickering and fighting between these groups who lived in Yathrib all of the time. And so the people, some of the people of Yathrib, having heard of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, they had come to make pilgrimage, not the pilgrimage we're familiar with, but the pilgrimage of the polytheistic time of Jahiliyyah, the pilgrimage of ignorance. They'd come to this time during the pilgrimage time, and they met with Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and they made the first pledge of Aqaba, the pledge to follow his way, the way of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, and they pledged to return the second year and talk to him about a possible offer to migrate to Yathrib. Now, let's understand the context. This is about 620 Common Era. And the year before, 619, thereabouts, the year of woe, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, had suffered two major setbacks. He'd suffered two major setbacks. One, the death of Abu Talib, his uncle. Even though his uncle never took Shahada, he protected him. He protected him. Remember, we talked about patronage before. Nobody could move against him, even though they were enraged at the message that he brought. Abu Talib had protected him until his death. And the second thing was the death of his beloved wife, Khadija. May Allah be pleased with her. She was the first Muslim. She encouraged him. She supported him. She gave him the space in order to do the things that he needed to do. And she died in the same year. It's called the year of woe. And so, being a human being, he was not in the best psychological mode at this particular time. When this delegation came from Yathrib, and met him at Aqaba near Minna in Hijaz, and they made a pledge to him. The second pledge included a pledge to making allegiance to him and asking him to make hijrah, to migrate to Yathrib. Now, let's understand that this migration was very, very important in the history of Islam, simply because Islam went from being a minority religion and it went to being a religion that had a primary authority in Yathrib, which became known as Medina, the city of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. So this is a dramatic change and a dramatic shift. So we have the whole idea of the mediation that they were calling for from Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. One of the primary reasons that they came because they heard about how he was a wise person, how he'd even mediated affairs before he took the prophethood. He was known as Al-Amin, and he was known as trustworthy. And this is the kind of person you want to mediate affairs, somebody whose judgment you could trust and you felt that he would stick to right no matter what. He was known as Al-Amin. We know the story of the Black Stone, where the Quraysh, the polytheistic Quraysh, were rebuilding the Kaaba, and he helped them solve this problem. And so they had heard of him before. So when it came to mediation, he had had a wide reputation. So now what we're looking at in this migration from Mecca to Medina, we have a merger between two different cultures. We've had this. We've seen mergers between major giants in the United States of America or international corporations, AOL merging with Time Warner, for instance. And always one of the big issues with the merger is whether the culture of the two organizations are compatible. And so you have this situation with the merger between Mecca and Medina. You have people coming from a commercial culture going to an agricultural culture. Think about it for a moment. People coming from a culture that thrives on the mercantile, thrived on buying and selling, thrived on this situation, to a situation where people were more settled and more of an agricultural culture. You can find this kind of difference in culture by two cultures that are next to one another, much less two cultures that were far apart from one another. So you had a merger where you could predict that there would be some differences in values and outlook in the world simply because these were two different cultures. In addition, you had two groups of people, the people who made hijrah, the Muhajirin, and the people who were called the Ansars, the helpers of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, both of which, given their status with the Prophet, might feel that they were a special or chosen people. The people who made hijrah, because they left, they gave up everything, and many of them knew the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, throughout his life, and they knew him when he got his revelation, and they joined him earlier on. And they might have thought of themselves as being very, very special for that reason. The Ansar, on the other hand, might have thought of themselves being very, very special for the reason that they had come and sought him out and gave him refuge from a very, very hostile situation that he was facing in Mecca from the Quraysh, and particularly from some members of his families. And so we're looking at a merger not only between two cultures, but a situation wherein the people who were coming with Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the people who had went and got him and had joined him, the Ansar, the helpers, would have cause to think that I'm better than him, would cause to think that I'm better than him. That is, the people coming with Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, would think that they were better than the Ansar because they'd known him for so long and they were with him from the beginning, and they were from Mecca, the place he was born. And the Ansar might think they were better off, and they certainly were economically better off, because when many of the people made hijrah from Mecca to Medina, they were forced to leave their properties, sometimes leave their families behind. And so economically and sometimes socially, culturally, they in fact were better off. But they felt they were better off because they knew the Prophet. They had been with him from the beginning. Some of them had been with him from early on, and they knew him growing up and the like, and they thought they were better. This is a recipe for disaster. Two different kinds of social economic cultures, two groups of people who felt that they had a special place. And this is part of the genius of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, that he executed this merger in an excellent way. One of the major things that he did was he devised this way of brotherhood, mu'aqada, this brotherhood that was so close that he had Ansar and Muhajirin pair with one another, that is, people from Mecca and people from Medina originally, to pair with one another as close as brothers, and that they would be looking out for one another. And this effected the merger in a very, very positive way without the obvious infighting, that you expect from people coming from a different culture and people who had a different special relationship with Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Brilliant move and strategy by creating this relationship that was close as brotherhood between the two people. And we know many, many stories that we can't go into right now. Again, if you look at the book Al-Umari, the Medinian society in the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, a very short book. This will give you the details of this situation, how the rich and poor work together, how the Meccans and the Medinas work together under the leadership of this brilliant merger leader, leaders. Now, the third and final point for this particular episode is the issue of mutuality. And this brings us to something called the Charter of Medina, the Charter of Medina. In the Charter of Medina, which was approved by Allah, right, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, this is the charter that was written down that was to govern the relationships between the Arabs of Medina and the governing relationship between the Arabs and the Jews of Medina, governing relationships between the Muslims, governing relationships between the Muslims and non-Muslims. This was a brilliant, brilliant move. Aside from the move of creating the brotherhood, writing down this charter was a brilliant, brilliant move because it outlined the authority, the relationship, and the responsibilities that people had between one another. And what it did, it established the rule of law in Yathrib, which would be called Mecca at this particular time. This is a very, very important point. You cannot have civilization unless you have forbearance. You can't have civilization unless you have rule of law. What do I mean by rule of law? Rule of law is the idea that no matter who you are, no matter what your status is in the community, there's certain principles and ideas and values that you must adhere to. We'll take up this issue as we continue our discussion about renewing civilizations, what we can learn from the best practices of the Muslims in the third segment. We hope that you'll watch the next segment. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Oh, people of the world.